We've done several stories about the misuse of non-disclosure agreements in recent years, and we've been asking members of the Houston government about their decision not to move forward with legislation banning the misuse of NDAs. Recently, 70,000 members of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour added their names to the list of people asking for such a ban. After that, we invited Justice Minister Brad Johns on the show to talk about why the legislation's not going ahead. He declined, and his office sent a statement that says, in part, currently, if a victim wants to talk and not sign an NDA, they can. But if they choose not to talk about it, which some victims do, and be compensated, they should have that right and choice. Banning NDAs would be taking some power away from victims. Right now, they have the option. We mentioned that response on the show on Friday when we told you that King's and Acadia universities have now signed on to the pledge to not use NDAs. And that brought us an exasperated email from Claudia Chender, the leader of the provincial NDP. She's the sponsor of legislation that was introduced last year to ban the misuse of NDAs, and she's on the line. Ms. Chender, welcome back to Information Morning.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, you heard the statement there that we received back from the Ministry of Justice. What do you think of their take on the topic?
Well, I think exasperated is just exactly the right word, Portia. We've been in this conversation for a couple of years now, and I think that it's really important to go back to the basics here. In their statement, I know to you, and in their previous statements, the Minister of Justice and the Premier have said that they don't support the misuse of non-disclosure agreements. They don't support the idea that victims would be forced to sign them. Mm-hmm. And yet they won't do anything to prevent that. They say they want to preserve people's ability to enter into a non-disclosure agreement if they wish. And our bill, in fact, preserves that. It just says that they need to have independent legal advice. And again, the government says they support the idea that if a victim has legal advice, they could enter into this. But the thing about a government is that if they support an idea, they have the tools at their disposal to make that idea real. And for whatever reason, this government is refusing steadfastly to do this in the face of, as you said, overwhelming opposition to their stance. We have the entire Federation of Labour. We have 2 universities. I'm hoping that there will be more to follow. We have our neighbouring jurisdiction of Prince Edward Island that has passed that legislation. And, I think we have to remember that this ultimately is about protecting people from being silenced by legal tools. And we have lots of examples around the world, across Canada, and right here in Nova Scotia where that has happened. In the United States, it was Harvey Weinstein and PEI. It was gross misconduct by people at the University of PEI. We have examples, that we've been wrestling with in my lifetime in the Catholic Church. We have examples of Hockey Canada. And, I was really struck that John McKigan, who's deals with lots of these kinds of legal issues, has said that, for every case that he's tried, it's almost always one abuser and many, many victims. And the reason that we can have that many victims of one abuser is because that activity is silenced. And if we don't stop that silencing, we perpetuate these harms.
And there's certainly, as you point out, many examples of the misuse of NDAs. Had your bill been accepted, or if it were to be, how do you envision that legal advice piece being supported perhaps by the government?
Oh, well, there's lots of ways that the government can support legal advice. I mean, I think legal aid is funded by the government. There's legal information clinics. There's all kinds of ways that the government can help independent legal advice. And in fact, in the last several years, the Liberal government did create some free legal advice. I know a number of years back, for victims. There are lots of ways that can be facilitated. But at the end of the day, I think it goes back to, the first part of our conversation, that if the government wishes to do something, it can. And yet we still have a government that is refusing to act. And so now they say they're providing an explanation, but their explanation doesn't hold water. And, I'll just remind your listeners that it's a real about face. When I was in opposition with the Progressive Conservatives, they signaled support for this idea. When they made it into government, they said that legislation was forthcoming. And then they did an about face, and this isn't the only thing that they've done an about face on in that manner, but it's certainly a really important one in terms of making sure that victims are protected and that, perpetrators can't buy their way out of misconduct. And so it's something that we're going to continue to press.
As someone who has, inside knowledge of the workings of bills and government, can you explain in any way that we haven't heard so far about why there has been a backing away from legislation around the misuse of NDAs, these about faces?
I can't, and this is why that exasperation comes in, particularly in the wake of the findings of the Mass Casualty Commission, which, I think that the entire section of that report that deals with gender-based harm, really is a wake-up call in general around transforming the way in which we protect victims of violence and which we see early warning signs and have just a more kind of compassionate and justice-based culture. I think that this is some low-hanging fruit in that regard. So, I can only assume that they've gotten advice from someone that they're not choosing to disclose, that this would somehow be a liability for them. But of course, that's troubling in its own right. And so, I think it's deeply disappointing that the Minister of Justice won't come on your show and talk about it. Anyone who wants to go back and watch the exchanges we had about this in the legislature, I would say they were frankly embarrassing. We would ask questions and the minister would stand up and say, "We're not moving forward." And then he would sit back down. There was no explanation.
Well, Ms. Gender, we have to leave it there. I appreciate you joining us this morning to talk a bit about your bill and where the situation stands now. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Portia.
That is Claudia Chender, the leader of the Nova Scotia New Democrat Party.